Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today over your lunch hour for another one of our WESC webinars. We are so excited to have you here today. My name is Ali Ramsey, WESC's Executive Assistant and Communications Coordinator. And I just want to give a big shout out to today's webinar sponsor, that is Peter Lucas Project Management. So thank you so much for sponsoring all of our webinars. Our topic today is a really important one. It's cybersecurity and is presented by Keith, who is the Director of Data and Security at WBM Technologies. If you have any questions for Keith as we go through the presentation, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box. If you scroll down there is a chat box as well as a Q&A box. So if you could keep all of your questions in the Q&A box, but use the regular chat box. If you want to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, go ahead and do that. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. You'll receive an email tomorrow around this time with a link to the recording. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Keith to start the presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Ali. And I think you have to actually turn on my video as well. It says I can't, it says you have to enable my video.
Oh, weird.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, perfect. I exist. Awesome. And I will share my screen as well here. Awesome. So yes, thank you so much. And once again, I appreciate everyone here taking the time to join us today. I'm super excited to have the opportunity to speak with everyone here about cybersecurity. This is a world that is changing incredibly rapidly and has shifted really from something that's talked about kind of secretly in server rooms to something that's regularly on the news. It's talked about at a board level and can have serious impacts on the longevity and viability of really any business. To start off with, as Ali mentioned, my name's Keith. I'm responsible for the data and security group at WBM Technologies. For those of you who don't know, WBM Technologies is a managed service provider. We deliver full-scale managed services, end-user computing, enterprise service desk, and managed print services to some of Western Canada's leading organizations, and are proudly delivering these services really from 5 interconnected Western Canadian operations centers with over 400 team members now. I have the privilege of being responsible for the solutions and operations of our data and security practice in really what continues to be an industry that's evolving at a pretty crazy pace. Now, at WBM specifically, we have the challenge of not only securing our own environment, but also our customer ones as well. And this work has evolved over time from, as you can see here, our original Saskatchewan heritage. This is our storefront in the 1950s, where we sold and repaired typewriters and adding machines. To the work that we're doing today as one of the country's largest technology services providers, delivering these services right across the globe from here in Western Canada. So one thing that isn't slowing down at all is our use of technology. Our reliance on it grows a little more every day, with incredible gains in productivity from Microsoft 365 to advanced insights from AI or things like machine learning. One thing I think we can all probably agree on is that the value of what we are doing from a technology perspective together is increasing. And with that, so is the risk of really what happens if our data gets in the wrong hands or if we lose access to it altogether. But before I get started, I want to, you all to humor me a little bit and take a moment to really think about why you signed up for the webinar today, dedicated your lunch hour, and maybe write down in front of you one thing you were hoping to get out of it, the session, hoping to know about cybersecurity, and just write that down in front of you. I also want to challenge everyone today to think about security a tiny bit differently. Whenever I first go into an organization to talk about security, there's a really traditional vision that everyone always has. And it used to be this department of no, it's the reason that we couldn't do certain things. I remember times when it's like, don't share your credit card online because it's dangerous. Make sure you don't download that song or that video because it's going to contain viruses and so on. And that, security really gained this reputation of the department of why you can't do things. There's a lot of fear created around security, and I think that a lot of it is valid and real. But I also think that there's this untalked about component of security, and it's the fact of what it actually allows us to do. Without security, we can't buy Amazon purchases with confidence. We can't run payroll from the cabin. We can't do an RFP out of a coffee shop. I challenge you here, and as we talk through today, to look at security as really the foundation of what we're able to do, not necessarily the thing that's in the way. And I will be the first person to say there's some very real risks out there, but there's also a really significant advantage for organizations that can find a way to build on that foundation and find ways to enable security to have them work in different ways. So if you take a little bit of a trip down memory lane, the problem of security, even in its most restrictive sense, is that this is a problem that used to be a much simpler one. If we think about it, most companies had a head office, a large majority of their team working right from one single location. And the cool thing about that is you can actually protect them, similar to a moat on a castle. Technology groups used to be able to build defenses around their head office. You'd allow for multiple layers of security for those folks working right inside that you could protect. And as the emergence of new tools and technologies arrived, greater connections to the outside world, all of that, new ways of work emerged. And all of a sudden, technology groups now have to figure out how to secure a home office or a remote office. And then all of a sudden, Microsoft 365 enables it even further. And your office could actually be anywhere. It can be a coffee shop, an airport, your living room. And that perimeter continues to expand. And the moat grows larger and larger. And just the challenge around supporting that becomes more and more real. And then COVID happened, right? And so all of a sudden, companies went from multiple offices or maybe one office to hundreds or thousands of offices, which were people's houses overnight, rapidly expanding that perimeter that those technology groups needed to protect. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a prediction that a lot of the cyber criminals would use the disruption by COVID and chaos to actually further their agendas. And those predictions were correct. In the last year, there was almost a 400% increase in cyber criminal activities. And this turned what was already a lucrative industry into one that was creating billions of dollars in losses for both the private and public sector. And so I want to, be clear here too. This translates into risks not only for loss production, but also for knowledge. If you look, from a Canada perspective, one of the greatest threats that's facing us is not just our businesses and continuities. It's also the loss of IP. And so this is a very real thing to consider. In fact, data is probably one of the most valuable commodities in the world right now. And it's clear that as the value of our data continues to go up, so does that need to clearly manage our risk. So today, I kind of want to talk to you about three different things. First, I really want to discuss the new realities of cyber risk, understanding who some of those cyber criminals actually are targeting. Second, I want to dive a bit into the risks and the role that you and your teams can play in what I like to call the human firewall. And then finally, I'd love to talk a little bit about what's happening across the business and regulatory landscape and why, as entrepreneurs, this matters to you. I'm hoping to leave a good amount of time at the end for Q&A as well. And I'm happy to dive into any more kind of focused conversations at that time too. So when we think about the new reality of cyber, much of that discussion has shifted from protection and kind of locking down the fort to really a topic of risk management. The reality is that there's an entire industry dedicated to exploiting organizations through means of ransomware, information theft, blackmail, that list goes on. The industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry per year. And if we looked at it as a traditional business segment, it's probably one of the fastest growing business segments in the world. Through this growth, these cyber criminals have learned a few things. They've started to actually segment almost like a true market system. You have different organizations focusing on parts of the supply chain. Some are writing code, some are writing phishing emails, some are really experts at locking down systems or finding exploits. And one thing they've learned is that it's actually way easier for them to focus on exploiting, 100 small businesses than to spend months or years orchestrating complex attacks like someone like a Microsoft or an Amazon. With this, a majority of small business employees have experienced and reported at least one cyber attack in the last year. If we were in person, I'd probably ask everyone, raise your hand if you've ever had your credit card stolen. Raise your hand if you've ever received a phishing email. And I could almost guarantee that everyone would probably raise their hand. This is not something that is, happening in a faraway land or overseas or only to big corporations. This is something that is very real across the business communities we're working in. And what becomes pretty alarming is when we look across that business landscape, not only are these attacks more prevalent in the SMB and small and medium-sized business segments, the impacts also seem to be more significant here. When we look at some research that was done last year, only a small percentage of businesses actually believe they have the right controls in place. And a large chunk of people don't even feel like they really have a plan. You combine that with the crippling financial impact of some of these attacks and what they can do to businesses. And it's really heartbreaking to see kind of the sheer amount of risk that exists today across that business ecosystem. And when I say risk, I really mean that in its simplest form. Security really is all about risk and controls. By understanding your current risk profile and finding ways to mitigate those risks, you're really on your first step to gaining a foothold in your cyber journey. One of the first things that we do when we work with someone starting to evaluate their security posture is to map out what their risk impact and tolerance is for many of their key business systems. You'd be really surprised at the answers. I commonly hear people talk about the sheer chaos that would be unlocked if their ERP was down for just 15 minutes. Or on the other hand, I've literally had someone tell me that their organization could shut off their computers and walk away from them for 2 weeks and not be impacted at all. This doesn't just apply to access to information, but also the sensitivity of the information itself. For example, if you're starting up an organization that's focused on a new way to analyze financial data, it really could be crippling if there was a data breach or that financial data got out, even if you're still working out of the garage. Once you understand where that risk is, you can really now then look at understanding and mapping those existing controls or protections you have in place and understand if it's in line with the tolerances you have, and then essentially continue to rinse and repeat. And really at its simplest form, that's what security becomes. And although it's a super, I could say, simple interpretation, the reality is that is security. And the more difficult that you make it for someone to gain access to the thing you don't want to, the less, they're going to have a path of least resistance. There's no single silver bullet, but there is some help. There's a lot of different guiding frameworks and controls in place. This is the Nist Framework, and probably one of the more common ones you're going to see across the business landscape. This is something that was created by the US military in terms of some initial cyber controls after 9/11. And this Nist framework is really helpful and was built for highlighting those exact areas to focus on when implementing security controls. Here, if you look around the wheel, you can see a chronology that is really clear that has representation all the way around the wheel, from identifying those threats and risks, to protecting the environment, to detecting if someone has bypassed any of those protections, responding to active threats, and then if all else fails, recovering what may have been lost. And in each of those segments, you can then apply a process, a technology, or people controls, some of which cost money, some of which are simply decisions you need to make as a business on how you want to handle those scenarios. And then you find ways to essentially make it more difficult for attackers to be successful in any of those phases. One thing that I always love to focus on as well is the ability to recover. I mentioned the likelihood of having some sort of cyber event is going up, right? I actually say it's not a matter of if, but when for most organizations. And having things like segmented and proper backups is one thing that makes it so, you can align that recovery timeline with something that makes sense for your business. And, like anything, you can actually make it so that you have a very resilient recovery timeline where, you can be up in 2 minutes. Obviously, that's going to cost more than if it, you say, the example I had before from 2 weeks, but aligning those things is really important. And the ability to recover is that kind of final piece to help you clearly kind of sleep and feel good about things. Now, I know that I promised as well that I would share some of that tactical knowledge in terms of some of those things that are really crucial to have in place. I created this list just as almost a must-have of what I would consider the bare requirements of a strong security posture now. And this list is built with really the mid-market SMB in mind. No longer do you need to invest in building a 40-person team and a world-class security operation that's running 24/7. A lot of these controls can be put in place and have been put in place by businesses of all sizes relatively inexpensively. And I won't go into specific details around all of these, but the things that I would consider a must. Next generation firewalls. When we talk about that traditional kind of moat theory, when you have traditional offices, what next generation of firewalls allow you to do is really control what's going in and out of the environment. I almost liken it to a airport baggage X-ray machine where you can see the traffic that's coming through, like you're looking into a suitcase. If you think about all of the traffic on the internet being encrypted, it allows you to see what you're actually letting into the environment before you actually allow it in. And just allowing some of that more granular control is a really strong level if you're still working out of a physical office. One of the best bang for your buck, and you're probably even seeing this in terms of your banking, you're probably seeing it in terms of your Microsoft accounts and that kind of stuff, is multi-factor authentication. One of the most common exploits to get access to an environment is simply having someone's password. There's far too many people that share their passwords around or use the same password for everything. And if only having the password was the single way to get entry to an account, it makes it really easy to gain access to whatever you're trying to get access to. By pairing it with something that you physically have, like your phone, like an app on your phone, like a phone call, you can all of a sudden pair something that which is your password, with something that exists personally with you, to be able to stop someone from China or Russia or any other country hacking into your environment from those locations. Finally, one thing that people often overlook is the idea of actually spam filtering and sandboxing. One of the most common ways to do this is within Microsoft, there's the Microsoft Defender, where it actually looks at all of the attachments that are coming in. In some cases, it'll actually open them up in a safe sandbox to make sure there's nothing malicious in there, but it's a really great step to break that down. Endpoint detection and response, and this is probably different than what I would have said 6 months ago. This is more than antivirus. I hold a firm belief that antivirus is no longer a sufficient protection, right? If you think about the human element of these cyber criminals, they know how to bypass a lot of the antivirus. And we shifted our entire client community to an endpoint detection and response. So you actually have a human element examining the trends across these desktops aligned with the technology. It becomes really important to mitigate a lot of the actual active risks in any environment. Preventatively, doing things like making sure you're patching and updating your computers, your phones, your technology is a must. From that resiliency standpoint, having backups of anything you have on a server, but also one thing that's becoming really common is actually finding ways to back up things like your Google or 365 environments, so that you have a copy of that in the event that it's deleted, in case your password gets changed or anything like that. And then finally, from a cyber insurance standpoint, if all else fails, you have insurance for your car, you have insurance for, you have insurance for a lot of things, but I think only about 9% of organizations right now have cyber insurance. And so this is a huge opportunity to mitigate a lot of that risk from your business, to make sure you have the appropriate risk tolerance in place. And the interesting thing is, from a cyber insurance standpoint, they're now looking at many of the other things on this list as prerequisites in order to even qualify for a policy. And then finally is the idea of security awareness training, which I'm going to dive into a little bit more. As we talked through those technology controls, the security awareness training, and the people element is one cost-effective and very important aspect, and that's your employees. The fact is, you could spend $1 trillion a year on cybersecurity, and a single wrong click from an employee could let an attacker right into the environment. In fact, that's actually often the case. A majority of data breaches that happen are not the result of some sort of elaborate, complex hack, but rather one of social engineering or human error. And it's really tough to keep up. As the hackers get smarter and smarter, it gets tougher and tougher to tell the difference between what's real and what's fake. We've very quickly moved from easily identifiable phishing attempts to elaborate and targeted social engineering attacks. One of the highest value investments that you can make in the security is effective security awareness training for your teams. And the really cool thing is that this is not now just a skill that's important in the workplace. This is something that will genuinely make the lives of your employees safer and easier all around, because the workplace is not the only place that they're experiencing those threats. Finally, helping put in place things like having complex passwords, not having employees share passwords or use shared accounts. Multi-factor authentication can go a really, really long way. In fact, one other thing I want to mention along the human element is that spirit of enablement. One element that's often overlooked is that sometimes the way people work can also lead to security gaps in the organization. One example we run into all the time is how people save their files. Often when we go into an organization, we'll find people saving things everywhere, to their desktop, to a personal Dropbox. Maybe there's a rogue USB. And that does two things. One, it creates havoc for any organization trying to manage and secure your data or know where it is. And two, it also creates a super clunky end user experience for those team members who spend increasingly long amounts of time trying to remember which cloud platform or USB or where they actually saved it. We often find teams spending 20, 30, 40 minutes a day simply looking for information. A quick security and a quick end user win we often find is helping organizations just use the tools they've invested in. If they're using Microsoft 365, you can allow for the security and governance of the data, but also have an incredible impact on how end users are working and are truly enabling that modern work environment without having to compromise on security. And finally, in this new world of increased risk has to be taken seriously. Cyber crime itself is a very real problem. It's not going away. In fact, the threat itself is increasing. As a business owner, cybersecurity really needs to be at the forefront of planning, and it needs to be a real discussion around investment, around risk, and around priority and how it gets prioritized in your business for continued and successful scale. This is not something we're just seeing as an internal check mark either. Whether you're looking for external investment, whether you're pursuing new or global clients, or simply looking to get a cyber insurance policy, the ability to clearly articulate your risk, the ability to clearly articulate your security controls and your security profile is a completely new language. And it's a crucial requirement for business leaders and owners to be able to speak to around the boardroom table. Even at a macro level, there is increasing corporate policy emerging, whether it be, government guided guidance on how to mitigate threats. This is an executive order that was issued last year on improving the nation's cybersecurity, to very serious data implications for anyone doing business with clients in Europe. If you are working with anyone in Europe, you are subject to GDPR, which is an incredibly onerous data protection and governance policy that has some very significant financial implications. And then finally, even understanding kind of within Canada, implications of things like PIPEDA. Balancing security and risk itself can be a really cumbersome activity, but it's also really something that can set you apart. And so that's kind of where I want to actually stop here for a little bit, not with a story of doom and gloom or the scary world of technology, but actually something completely opposite, right? I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, security can actually be an incredible enabler. I think that security allows us to do things we never thought possible with the confidence that we can honor the commitments to our employees, to our teams, to our clients, that we can do work and we can keep them safe in the process. And in fact, it doesn't have to be worse. It can actually be way better. This is a story of ESIP, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the organization, but ESIP is the Early Childhood Intervention Program. And so they do some really, truly incredible work. This is an organization that works really closely with children with developmental delays and has been providing really key services, to families across Regina for over 40 years. If you imagine the work they do, and then imagine the disruption that was experienced during COVID, there's really only one path forward for them, and that's finding a way to leverage technology. At the time of COVID-19, ESIP had never once delivered any sort of virtual program. The only way that they could pivot and the only way that they could actually adapt was having faith that their technology worked and that they had the security to actually facilitate what ended up being 667 virtual visits in 1 year alone. So this is an organization that went from 0 virtual visits in 2019 to almost 700 the following year. You can see quotes from their customers. Honestly, the way ESIP quickly adjusted and adopted was impressive and appreciated. Great job. And you can see how this actually impacted their staff and teams. And so similar to that file sharing example, allowing their team to learn to use technology in different ways, not only enabled a positive experience for their teams and families, but also allowed information to really flow in a seamless and managed way. You can see the before and afters, right? There's an organization that was not comfortable using Teams, was not comfortable using OneDrive, was not comfortable using SharePoint. And very rapidly, by shifting on some of these tools, was able to not just use these tools, but also become ambassadors of how this technology worked. The Microsoft applications have totally revolutionized ESIP and the way we provide service to our clients. And then when you look at the impact, they didn't just find a way to make it work. They're actually able to get more efficient. 93% of staff reported time savings. 92% of team members said their job actually became easier. And this was quantified. When we mentioned the security outputs of being able to save things in the same place, also a 40-minute per day per staff member time saved. So these are incredible leaps forward, also while doing this in a secure way. I love the scope from Kendra. Before our technology program, all I knew was Microsoft, was Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. Now I don't know how I would live without it. And I think what was most incredible is that this generated a better client experience. Unanimously, the team thought this technology and peace of mind that the work could be done in a secure way meant they could deliver really a better experience to their customers, and they could do more of that work that really mattered. So in summary, I think, there's a lot of scary things out there from a security perspective, but there's also a ton in your control. For those of you that figure out how to leverage working in a secure way to your advantage, whether it's attracting investors or whether it's using your security posture to grow with clients, that's where it can become a ton of fun. I wanted to leave a lot. I know we have a smaller group, so I'm really excited to dive into some Q&A. I'm happy to dive further into any of the topics we had before, but yeah, I'll check the chat here and see if there's any questions.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A. We are a smaller group here, so we'll be able to see them either way.
Do you see any questions in there, Ellie?
Not yet. Keith, is there a way that somebody could contact you or somebody else at WBM if they do think of a question after the fact?
Of course, yes. I realize I can put my email and chat and stuff in the
Perfect.
in the chat. And I think that there's a ton of different stories around cybersecurity, around the work that other customers are doing and how they're really adapting the modern workplace in a secure way. So I will share the website as well as my contact details. And we have our first question, which is incredibly exciting, from Yvonne. Is there a standards assessment to evaluate risk? Awesome question, Yvonne. And so yes, there are a bunch of different standard frameworks that organizations will use to evaluate risk. So Nist is one of those. So if we look at Nist itself, and it would have been the most boring presentation ever, but there's hundreds of different line items under each of those things, which kind of validate whether or not you have certain controls. And so in going through that, you can use that as the framework to be able to say, okay, I have this, I don't have this, I have this, I don't have this. Other common ones are like an ISO or something like that. What some organizations do is that, that's essentially an internal evaluation where you can say, do I match up to these controls? But some organizations are also looking for kind of external validation. And that's where you'll see like organizations that have things like a SOC compliance, where they're essentially following those controls, but then they're also getting external validation from someone to say, I essentially certify that these are in place. And that's something you can share with your clients or partners or prospects or investors to really validate that security posture exists and is best in class. Mr. Ian Petker, all right, what actions should an organization take if they find themselves in a cyber attack situation? So I guess that is a very broad question in terms of the, I guess, what controls you have in place itself. If you have an IT team, obviously you want them to be dealing with that. The first thing that I would traditionally say is for someone to call their insurance company, right? When you have a cyber insurance policy, you are going to have, they're going to have response teams, they have negotiators, they have a whole bunch of different things in place to mitigate that risk from them also having to pay out. There's also elements of forensic data that needs to be preserved. There's elements of a whole bunch of kind of legal ramifications around how you actually respond to it. And so there's actually a fairly strict order of operations you want to follow in terms of any response actions. What that also means is that you are going to find yourself in a scenario where you have all of these controls in place and you're going to see active threats. You're going to maybe have a computer that's in the process of being ransomware. It doesn't mean you just do nothing. For example, if that were to happen to one of our customers, there would be a response to essentially mitigate that immediate risk so it wouldn't spread out, and to isolate that and then restore, but also making sure you preserve any of those forensics in the event of any broader ransomware or actual attack vector, that kind of thing. So hopefully that answers your question as well, both Yvonne and Ian. Oh, you're on mute, Ellie.
Oh, there we go.
We almost made it through.
If anyone else has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Oh, we've got a question in the Q&A box.
Oh, okay, let me just go over to that. How is data recovered if there is a cyber attack as that data is completely lost? So that is a great question, and that is where backups become really important. And so when in backups, there's essentially a 3-2-1 rule that is really important to follow when you think about how you're backing up your data. You essentially want 3 copies of your data in at least 2 different locations with at least 1 offsite from your environment. And I was thrown off by the would like to answer the question live there. And so if you have your data segmented, essentially what that will mean is you will be able to restore back to the point of when that last backup was, in the event that someone actually compromises your actual live data. So let's say that you had an organization and there was a full lockdown based on ransomware. You have a couple options in that scenario, right? One is you can pay the actual attacker and pay them in their crypto and whatever they would like. The other option is if you have kind of clean backups, you can actually just say, you know what, I'm willing to lose the 2 hours or 8 hours or day of data to restore to that previous point in time. And then you can do that from a clean backup. So the backups is incredibly important as part of that resiliency. And I would say that it's in a world where it is a matter of when, not if, that is one of the most beneficial things to be able to actually kind of sleep at night there. Hopefully that answers your question. Perfect. Oh, we have another one. Are there data specific attacks possible? So I'm not 100% sure what you mean by by data specific attacks, but there are, a variety of different things that people will do with different intentions. And so some cyber actors will essentially look across environments for vulnerabilities with the sheer intent of looking to just ransom your data, right? So they actually have zero interest in the data. They have a 100% interest in making sure you don't have access to it. And their assumption is that there's something valuable enough in there across the board that you will either pay the ransom or do something to get that back. Depending on the work that you do and depending on the sector you're in, there also might be more targeted specific things. So let's say, for example, someone is looking to, go specifically, and I see you clear right here, look after your financial data. There are studies that have shown that attackers can actually, if you don't have the right controls in place, live up to into your environment for months, kind of looking around and poking around and looking for the data that they want. And once they find that, that's when they'll actually essentially mount their attack, or they'll slowly exfiltrate that data, and you might actually never know, right? And so they might look for specific things, or they might just go for the low-hanging fruit, lock down the environment, and call it a day. So in terms of, there's also a whole I could probably do a whole hour on, data regulation and how people classify data and what that means from a risk standpoint. But hopefully that helps. I kind of walked around that a little bit. From Cambrine, how are Saskatchewan businesses being impacted, or are we a bit under the radar with less risk here? So I would say that cyber criminals are very opportunistic in the fact that they are going after all businesses regardless of geography, right? I think that there's a couple things that Saskatchewan and Canada in general has a really strong saturation of entrepreneurial small and mid-market businesses, which are a prime target for cyber criminals. And so, a lot of small businesses don't have the same kind of rigor and controls in place that we'll say a Microsoft would. And so that makes them easier targets. And there's countless examples you'll see in the news, that you'll see in the media around local Saskatoon, Regina, cyber attacks that have happened, not in history, I would say in the last couple of months and weeks and years, right? This is an active thing that is happening today. The other thing that becomes really, interesting to discuss is with the sectors that exist within Saskatchewan. When we think about, heavy agriculture, heavy energy, those are also targets that are, if we look at the geopolitical landscape, very much, I'd say, at a heightened risk sense. Based on things that are happening with Russia and Ukraine and all of that. Can you share any recent examples of general security vulnerabilities that may have affected organizations here in Saskatchewan? There are many. So just yesterday, there was two, right? So one, there's a very popular multi-factor authentication tool called Okta that had a bunch of their they were hacked, and they had a bunch of their admin stuff posted on the internet. And every day, every week, there's multiple security vulnerabilities that are discovered and published. So just yesterday, there was a high severity HP printer one, which allows organizations to look at HP printers and use those as an attack vector in an unsecured environment. There was a very prominent one just a little while ago with Log4j and Log4Shell. It made its way all the way to CNN in terms of an exploit that was written into most software applications that had to be really remedied. And in fact, about 30% of those vulnerabilities still actually exist in the wild from Log4j that haven't been patched or remedied. So I could, there's countless examples of security vulnerabilities that would be directly impacting businesses across the globe, but also directly in Saskatchewan. Awesome. Well, I think that looks like the questions have dried up a bit, but this has been fantastic. I really appreciate everyone's time today. And yeah, thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Keith. That was really informative, really helpful. Cybersecurity is something that's so prevalent right now. So we really appreciate you coming to speak with us about that. And just as a reminder to everybody on here that you will be able to view this webinar on our website around the same time tomorrow. We'll also send out a link to everybody so you'll be able to access it. And our next webinar, it's actually coming up next Wednesday. It's our virtual business growth luncheon, and this one is on exporting. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, please do so at west.ca/events. And thank you again, Keith, and thanks to everybody that joined us today.